On a quiet Finnish lake, in the early hours of a June morning in 1960, a nightmare unfolded inside a small canvas tent. 4 teenagers had set out for what should have been an innocent camping trip, but by sunrise, it would become one of Finnish history's most horrific and puzzling murder investigations ever, and for over 6 decades, the Lake Bodom murders have baffled police, terrified locals, and fueled countless theories. This is the Lake Bodom murders. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume. And I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. I went deep today, baby. But today, we are talking about an extremely baffling case, one that I was not familiar with at all. But now I'm all too familiar with it. And I'm gonna make you familiar with it as well, because these cold cases, man, they eat at me. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this puzzling Finnish case together. So before the tragic night at Lake Bodom, the victims were ordinary teenagers, enjoying the start of summer. Maile Emili Björklund, or Maile, often called Miley or sometimes Emili, was just 15 years old in the summer of 1960. In fact, she was only days away from her 16th birthday at the time of the camping trip, and she was a resident of the Helsinki suburb in Vanata. And Maile was, by all accounts, a typical Finnish teenage girl. She enjoyed school breaks, spending time with friends, and looking forward to adventures in the outdoors. And she was dating 18-year-old Nils Gustafsson, and the two planned to share this double-date camping trip with another couple. And the other couple was Anja Maki, who was also 15 years old and was Maile's close friend. And the two girls were classmates and neighbors in Vanata, and they decided to go camping together as a fun excursion to kick off the summer. And she was dating the 4th member of the group, Seppo Blauman, and her father was initially against the trip, but her mother was able to convince him to let her go. So in June 1960, Finnish summer days were long and bright, so a very enticing time for young teenagers like Anja to enjoy nature. And with her good friend Maile, and with their boyfriends along, Anja anticipated a night of laughter and memories by the lakeside. So Seppo Antero Blauman, who was 18 years old, was one of the 2 older boys in the group, and he was also from Vanata. And Seppo was best friends with Nils Gustafsson, so they were all really good friends. The 2 men specifically likely bonded over school classes, hobbies like motorcycles, and plans for the future. So at 18, Seppo would have been either just finished with secondary school or about to enter military service, as was customary for Finnish youths around that age. And physically, Seppo was a very able-bodied teen, and he actually worked as an apprentice electrician. And as the older boyfriend, Seppo might have felt responsible for the safety of the group during this trip, and he rode his motorcycle with Anja on the back to the campsite, carrying gear and in high spirits for the night under the stars. And Nils Gustafsson, who was also 18 years old but slightly younger, is the most complex figure in the story. At the time of the trip, Nils was an athletic blonde teenager from Vanata, known to be popular, outgoing, and fun-loving. And he was Seppo's best friend, as we know, and Maile's boyfriend. And Nils had just reached adulthood at 18, and like Seppo, he enjoyed riding motorcycles. So obviously, the 2 men each had a motorcycle, which they used to ferry their girlfriends to Lake Bodom. And Nils, by appearances, was also just a normal teen, excited for a camping adventure with his sweetheart and close friends. So these 4 teenagers formed 2 couples in a tight-knit friend group, and everyone in the group got along and looked forward to spending time together. In essence, this was a sweetheart's getaway for 2 young couples, and the dynamic was likely typical of teenagers joking around. A bit of flirting between the couples, and mutual trust. And there was no indication before the trip of any serious tensions or conflicts among them. And it's important to note these positive relationships because later on, some theories would suggest some internal strife or jealousy, but we'll get into that later. So at least at the outset, all 4 seemed happy to be together, and little did they know that this camaraderie and youthful adventure would soon turn into a scene of unimaginable horror. So Saturday, June 4th, 1960, was the day the group set out for their camping excursion. And the teenagers, as we know, chose Lake Bodom, or in Finnish, Bodom, which was a scenic lake about 20 km west of Helsinki, as their destination. So Lake Bodom, located near the city of Espoo, was known to be a popular camping spot among locals. It was just a place where campers could pitch a tent, swim or fish, and just enjoy nature. And it's described as a large, tranquil lake surrounded by villages and forests of birch and pine. In other words, an ideal setting for an overnight outing in the wilderness without being too far from home. And the decision may have been spontaneous or planned in advance, and sources aren't clear on exactly who suggested it, but all four eagerly agreed, and that's what we know for sure. And all of them being from the city of Vanata, a relatively short distance away, made Lake Bodom an attractive and convenient spot for a quick getaway. And the boys, Nils and Seppo, wanted to make use of their recently acquired motorcycles and were excited to take their girlfriends on a ride-in-camp adventure. So with parental permission sorted, as needed for 15-year-old girls, and their destination picked, the stage was set. So the group packed light, as typical for overnight camping, and they had a single tent large enough to accommodate all four of them, which emphasized the coziness of their plan, roughing it, if you will, together under one canvas. So they were all staying in one tent, and they likely brought sleeping bags, some food and treats, and other essentials. Because they weren't traveling by motorcycle, everything had to be very compact. So we don't know if they carried any weapons or protection like a hunting knife for camping. Nothing of the sort is mentioned. So it appears they did not anticipate any danger from people or animals. And it's worth noting the natural phenomenon of the white night in Finland, which they were set to experience because in early June at that latitude, the sun barely dips below the horizon, meaning nightfall is more of a prolonged twilight. And one writer describes these white nights as having a strange grayish light, like someone dialed down the brightness for a few hours, and an almost eerie silence. So this ethereal atmosphere can be magical for campers, and for our four teenagers, the never-quite dark night was probably part of the thrill. And upon arrival, they would have seen a very picturesque lake and beautiful natural surroundings. And the area was also known to have a kiosk, which is a small convenience stand run by a local man and oft unhosted campers and hikers. And it's not clear if the teens stopped at the kiosk or interacted with locals upon arriving, but they proceeded to pick a spot for their tent. And they chose a spot along the shore for pitching the tent, a flat clearing not far from the water. And by all accounts, their arrival and setup went very smoothly. And Nils and Seppo likely helped each other assemble the tent, while Melee and Donjar might have laid out sleeping bags and gathered firewood. So with their camp established, the journey concluded and the leisure began. So the daylight hours of June 4th passed uneventfully, unpleasantly for the group, by all accounts. And the afternoon was likely spent in typical camping pastimes, possibly swimming in the lake's cool waters, lounging on the shore, and exploring the woods. And according to later reports, nothing unusual happened during that day. The friends enjoyed each other's company and the freedom of being out in nature. And the evening of June 4th was still bright due to that white night effect, but eventually a gray dusk settled. And at some point, the teens retired to their tent for the night. And for people in one tent would have been a very snug fit, and they likely arranged themselves with the couples next to each other. And based on diary evidence and witness accounts, the group did not venture away from their own campsite to socialize that night, at least not according to initial statements. So as far as the teens were concerned that night, they were alone and secure in their campsite. Now allegedly, there was mention of the boys being drunk in Melee's diary, but they would fall asleep and woke up around 2. Saroam, after which the boys got up for a bit, and the girls fell immediately back to sleep. And eventually they were all asleep inside their tent, and the night was calm, with the lake waters gently lapping in the pale night sky above. And it should have been a peaceful slumber in a beautiful place. However, as the early morning hours rolled around, an unknown terror crept toward the unsuspecting campers. So at approximately 4:00 to 6:00 am on June 5th, an unknown assailant lodged a frenzied attack on the 4 sleeping teenagers. And the evidence indicates that the killer struck from outside the tent, slashing and bludgeoning through the tent's fabric without ever entering it. In other words, the perpetrator used the tent itself as a barrier, blindly stabbing and swinging at the victims through the canvas walls. And the weapon was most likely a knife, possibly accompanied by a heavy blunt instrument. But the assaults were extremely violent and swift, and the teenagers were caught completely off guard because they were sleeping. And you could only imagine the confusion and terror inside that tent, with the sounds of the canvas ripping and screams of pain and the sudden realization that they were under attack. So the tent itself quickly collapsed onto the occupants during the onslaught, and much later witnesses would recall seeing the tent in a flattened state, as if it had imploded on itself. Investigators believe the assailant first cut the tent's guidelines or supports, perhaps to trap the victims inside the tent, and then stabbed downward through the material. But all 4 teenagers were injured in this gruesome attack, and 3 would not survive. But despite the viciousness of the attack, none of the victims managed to escape or fully fend off the assailant. And there are no reports of any of the teens getting out of the tent to run or fight, indicating how sudden and overwhelming the ambush was. And during the frenzied stabbing and bludgeoning, one victim, Nils Gustafsson, may have caught a fleeting glimpse of the attacker. And Gustafsson would be the lone survivor in this attack, and he would later claim that, in a brief moment of half-consciousness, he saw a dark figure dressed in black with bright red eyes looming over them. And this eerie description, "red eyes as if glowing," had become part of the legend of Lake Bodom. And it's unclear if this was a hallucination, a distorted memory. Perhaps the attacker had some reflective material, or it was a product of trauma, or just a genuine detail. But regardless, it was the only hint of the attacker's appearance given by any of the victims. And the assault likely lasted only minutes, but was absolutely devastating. And by the time the assailant was done, 3 of the 4 friends lay dead or dying, and the lone survivor was unconscious and gravely wounded. And the killer then left as mysteriously as he had arrived. And at around 6:00 a.m., not long after the attack, a pair of young birdwatchers in the area reportedly noticed something odd. In the distance, they saw a collapsed tent and a blonde-haired man walking away from the campsite. And the sighting would later become a crucial, if ambiguous, clue. So the birdwatchers did not approach the site, thinking perhaps that nothing was seriously wrong. And meanwhile, the murderer vanished into the early morning this time. And the crime was over in mere moments, but its repercussions were only just beginning. So the attack's aftermath for each of the 4 campers can be pieced together from the physical evidence and forensic reports. And tragically, Melee, Anja, and Seppo all sustained fatal wounds while Nils survived with serious injuries. So Melee suffered the worst fate of all victims, and she was found outside the tent, having been pulled or dragged part way out during the attack. And disturbingly, Melee was undressed from the waist down when discovered, and whether the assailant removed her lower clothing or it was a result of being dragged is uncertain, but the state of her attire suggested a possible sexual assault motive or grotesque staging. And Melee's injuries were also the most severe, and she had been stabbed dozens of times, far more than the others. And forensic analysis indicated that many of her stab wounds were inflicted after she was already deceased. So it's kind of in line with just a very angry sounding like personal attack, like a vengeance he had just for Melee specifically. And also Melee's head had been hit extremely hard, causing shattering injuries. So this was just extreme overkill for Melee, and it seems to me she was like the center of this person's rage. But since Melee was Nils's girlfriend, the only survivor's girlfriend, some later theories speculated about personal jealousy or hatred directed at her. We'll talk about that later. But in 1960, investigators could only note that she clearly bore the brunt of the killer's fury. And Melee's body was also found lying on top of the collapsed tent canvas near Nils, but there was no sign of her actually being sexually assaulted in terms of confirmed evidence. But her being partially unclothed and the brutality left the possibility in people's minds. So Melee would die at the scene from a combination of stab wounds and blunt force trauma. Now Anja's body was found inside of the tent, and she was likely attacked and killed before she had any chance to escape. and Anja's injuries, while fatal, were notably less extensive than Mei Lei's, and she had been stabbed and hit, but not to the excessive degree of her friend Mei Lei. And it's possible Anja died quickly from her wounds as well, but there was no indication that Anja was moved or deliberately posed either, as she simply remained where she was attacked inside the tent. And Anja's cause of death was the multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma to her head as well, consistent with the same weapons that killed the others. And the horror of all this suddenness meant Anja likely never even fully awoke before she was killed. And Seppo would also be found dead inside of the tent as well. So was the other man and the oldest in the group, and one might expect he'd have resisted the attack to some degree, but the situation gave him little chance given the fact that he was asleep, most likely. And Seppo's injuries included stab wounds and blunt force trauma as well, similar to Anja's. And there was speculation that Seppo might have awoken and confronted the attacker for at least a moment. However, at the crime scene, Seppo's body was found inside the tent with fatal wounds, indicating he did not get that far if there was any sort of scuffle. And notably, neither Seppo nor Anja were at act post-mortem like Mei Lei was. So their killings, while violent, seemed straightforward by comparison. So, at just 15 years old, and 18 years old, these poor teenagers lost their lives in what should have just been a safe camping trip. And then there was Nils, who was the sole survivor of this massacre. But he came exceedingly close to being the fourth fatality, cause he was found alive but unconscious, lying on the ground near the tents outside, on the same side as Mei Lei. Nils had severe injuries, his jaw was broken, he had fractured cheekbones, and a deep knife wound to his forehead, and he also sustained a serious concussion, and he was also covered in blood. And initially, responders thought he might die of his injuries because he was barely clinging to life when he was discovered. Nils was found barefoot, and notably, his shoes were missing from the scene. So it appeared he had been inside the tent during the attack and somehow ended up outside of the tent, possibly staggering out or being knocked out of the collapsed tent by the assailant, and he would collapse next to Mei Lei. And there are differing accounts of his exact position when he was found. Some say he was on top of part of the tent canvas, others that he was just beside it. But in any case, he was within a couple of meters of the other victims. But despite his grievous wounds, Nils was still alive when help finally arrived several hours later. And he had no memory of the actual attack, likely a merciful side effect of the head trauma, and, as mentioned, only later recalled a fleeting image of the red-eyed figure in black attacking them. So Nils's survival would have major consequences. It meant there was a witness, albeit with a shattered memory, and a victim who could later be scrutinized. On that morning in 1960, Nils was viewed purely as a victim who narrowly escaped the fate of his friends, and he was rushed to the hospital as soon as rescuers came, and his injuries were documented as consistent with being attacked by the same perpetrator who killed the others. So the scene at Lake Bodom on the morning of June 5th, 1960, was one of both confusion and horror because the teen's tent had been collapsed onto itself, visibly torn and soaked with blood, and blood splatter in pools around the site made it clear a vicious attack had occurred. And the tent fabric had multiple slashes and punctures from the knife thrusts, and inside the tent was a disarray of sleeping bags and belongings that were drenched in blood as well. And the entire area was eerily quiet in the early light of dawn, except for the distressing sight at the campsite itself. And evidence would indicate that the killer had attacked from outside, like we were talking about before, cutting the tent open and cutting downward. But remarkably, no murder weapon was found at the scene, so neither a knife nor any blunt instrument was recovered. And this meant the assailant took the weapons with them or disposed of them somewhere. Investigators later scoured the lake and surrounding woods, but the murder weapons have never been located. And another baffling aspect was that several of the victims' personal items were missing or oddly displaced. Like the keys to the teens, motorcycles were gone, yet the motorcycles were left parked near the campsite untouched, which is odd. And wallets and some articles of clothing were also reported missing. And most peculiarly, Nils Gustafsson's shoes were nowhere to be found at the campsite. So this was strange because one would expect shoes to be left by the tent entrance or inside. And an intensive search was launched for these missing items, and in the days to follow, some of the missing clothing on Nils' shoes were discovered about 500 meters, which is about a half a kilometer away from the tent hidden. It was as if the perpetrator had gathered certain items and stashed or tossed them while fleeing. And the shoes in particular would later become crucial evidence. But in 1960, it was simply perplexing to find them so far from Nils, who again was found barefoot. So why would a random killer take the time to remove and hide a victim's shoes? Does it really add up or make sense? I mean, none of this makes sense, but that's particularly odd. So the crime scene presented investigators with a chaotic mix of clues, intense violence, missing belongings, no obvious motive. And also notable, aside from the birdwatcher's account of a blond man walking away at dawn, there were no eyewitnesses to the crime itself, and the other campers in the area did not hear screams, or, if they did not realize what it was. And it's possible that any cries were muffled by the quick, incapacitating nature of the attack. And the scene was remote enough that help did not arrive until hours later, meaning the crime scene set exposed to the morning. And sadly, the way the scene was handled next would introduce its own set of problems. So despite the attack occurring around dawn, around 4:26 am, it would be several hours before the victims were actually found and help arrived. And the first people to notice something was wrong were the aforementioned small group of boys who were out bird watching in the area around 6:00 am. And they continued on their way, not immediately realizing that they may have witnessed a murderer fleeing. And as a result, the crime scene remained unattended for several more hours. And it wasn't until 11:00 am that the bodies were officially discovered, and a local man named Dristo Siren, identified in some reports as a jogger or carpenter out for a morning walk, came upon the campsite and saw the carnage. And he saw the tent flattened and bloodied, and the unmistakable sight of bodies either on top or inside the tent. And I can't imagine how he felt seeing this, but luckily, Risto immediately alerted authorities, and he contacted the police, who arrived at the scene by noon on June 5th. Some sources alternatively name a carpenter called Desko Eva Johansson as the discoverer. So it's possible that Johansson and Siren are the same person, or one of these people accompanied the other, or one did find it first, or by the other. So I'm not positive on that, but those are the two names we have. But regardless, the key point is that a local adult found the victims late in the morning and called police. So when police and medics arrived to this horror show in front of them, to their surprise and relief, they found Nils Gustafsson still alive despite his severe injuries. So medics quickly extracted Nils and rushed him to the hospital in Helsinki for emergency treatment, and the other 3 teenagers were confirmed dead at the scene. And the police began to secure the area, but crucially, their approach to the crime scene would be later seen as disastrously lax. Initially, however, their focus was on the possibility of catching the perpetrator nearby ungathering obvious evidence. So they had the birdwatcher's report, which gave them a rough timeline, and the murders likely happened shortly before that sighting. And the time of discovery at 11:00 meant the killer had around a 5-hour head start to escape, which is a lot of time. So law enforcement conducted a search of the vicinity, hoping the murderer or any weapon might still be around, but found nothing immediate. Meanwhile, news that 3 teens were slain at Lake Bodom spread very quickly, drawing curiosity and alarm. And unfortunately, as more people flocked to the scene and investigators swarmed in, the integrity of the physical evidence on site would suffer greatly. But the first priority was interviewing the only person who might tell them what happened, and that was the survivor, Nils Gustafsson. So Nils, obviously, was in no condition to give a full statement immediately, and he was transported to the hospital and treated for his broken jaw and other injuries. But when he was able to talk, Nils described the events as he remembered them, which unfortunately wasn't much turn. And he claimed to have little to no memory of the actual attack, likely due to his concussion and trauma. But Nils asserted that the night had been uneventful until he woke up in pain during the assault, and he recalled seeing a shadowy figure dressed in black attacking the tent, and said that this person had bright red eyes, an image that stuck with him from that split-second glance. But beyond that, Nils could not recount a clear sequence of events, and he did not remember any argument or disturbance before the attack, reinforcing that it just came without any sort of warning. And he couldn't say how he ended up outside the tent either, and presumably, he lost consciousness at some point in the struggle and woke up much later in the hospital. And over the days and weeks after the incident, Nils was interviewed multiple times, but his story remained that he remembered almost nothing. And this frustrated investigators who hoped for an indication, or at least a clue. And the birdwatcher's comment of seeing a man with blonde hair wasn't much to go on, and it was a slim lead in Finland especially, where blonde hair is very common. So it didn't narrow things down much at all. And importantly, at this early stage, police considered Nils Gustafsson a victim, not a suspect, cause his injuries were so severe and extensive that it seemed implausible he was anything but an attack party. In fact, decades after, Gustafsson's consistent claim was that he suffered a memory blackout and survived by luck, and he was generally believed. But Nils's last memory before the attack, aside from the attacker's image, was of the friends happily arriving and settling in the campsite itself. And everything after that turned into a nightmare he largely could not recall. This incomplete account with no motive, no clear perpetrator identity, meant that from the very beginning, the Lake Bodom case hinged more on physical evidence and investigative work than eyewitness testimony. And with Nils unable to name or describe the assailant in detail, the police had to cast a wide net in their investigation. And unfortunately, as they started that process, some critical mistakes would be made. And one of those major mistakes was that the police didn't cordon off the campsite adequately, as after they arrived around noon, multiple officers and even volunteers traipsed through the site without full regard for preserving evidence. In fact, crowds of people, including other police, locals, journalists, and curiosity seekers, were allowed to wander around the scene in the immediate aftermath, which, it doesn't make sense to me. But okay, it's a different time, I guess. Not really, it's 60 seconds. There's a lot of crime going on anyway. But the result was that footprints, potential trace evidence, and the original positions of items got trampled or moved, and later analysis slammed this as a serious contamination of the crime scene. And another issue was record keeping, because reports suggest that investigators failed to systematically document the scene before disturbing it, and photographs were far and few between, with only a handful of crime scene photos that actually exist, and some were taken after things had been moved. So, useless essentially. The precise measurements of distances on items' locations were not logged, which would severely handicap the forensics. Recognizing that items were missing, like the keys, wallets, clothing, and shoes, the police organized a search of all the surrounding area. And in doing so, they made yet another blunder by bringing in soldiers to comb the woods around the lake. And while well-intentioned, this resulted in dozens of additional people stomping through potential evidence zones. But the soldiers and searchers, as we know, did manage to find some of the missing items as mentioned, like Gustafsson's shoes and some clothing about 500 meters away. But several items, including the motorcycle keys and presumably the murder weapons, were never found. And these just early lapses gave the killer a tremendous advantage, as by the time the scene was cleared of contamination, any subtle clues like fingerprints, hair fibers, or shoe prints from the perpetrator were likely destroyed or hopelessly intermixed with others. And investigators were largely left with the victims' bodies and belongings as evidence, plus the accounts of the people like the birdwatchers. And another challenge was motive, as the crime did not immediately suggest one. Robbery didn't fit well since valuable motorcycles were left and only some personal items taken, possibly as trophies, potentially, cause we know killers do that. Ansau was considered because of Maylay's state, but aside from her being partially unclothed, evidence was inconclusive. And Ansaw's motive also didn't explain the males being killed as well at rare. And a crime of passion or personal conflict seemed unlikely given all victims were presumably friends and asleep at the time. So police were dealing with a bizarre, seemingly senseless massacre, And in the absence of obvious leads, they started exploring the idea of an outside attacker just roaming the area. And they questioned local residents, unknown troublemakers. And early on, one name emerged from locals' whispers, and that was a man who ran a nearby kiosk who had a reputation for hostility towards campers. We'll discuss this soon. However, initially, officers had no hard evidence against any particular individual, and no clear suspect emerged in the initial phase. The only description was the blonde man seen walking away and the red-eyed man in black. So police created a rough composite image based on the sighting and Nils's vague recollection, and basically it was just a generic idea of a blonde, possibly tall man, so you might as well have just drawn a stickman. And checkpoints were not immediately set up, paused by the time they considered it. Hours had passed and any culprit was long gone. And as days turned into weeks, the investigation just continued to struggle, and the botched crime scene handling meant that a wealth of forensic evidence was lost. And one newspaper even later harshly criticized the police, noting that careless onlookers and even curious campers all but destroyed the murder scene after police had left. And in these early weeks, investigators did their best with traditional detective work, interviewing anyone who might have been near Lake Bodom, checking alibis of local ex-convicts or mentally unstable individuals, and sending out alerts in case a bloodied suspect turned up at a hospital. And one actually did. But with each passing day, no arrest was made and the case began to cool down. And the groundwork, or lack thereof, laid in this initial investigation would deeply affect the decades to come, and leads that might have been solved with solid evidence turned into mere speculation. But still, the police did pursue several theories and suspects in the months and years after the murders. Some plausible, some more far-fetched. We will now turn to those suspects and theories that emerged as detectives and the public tried to answer the burning question: who killed the teens at Lake Bodom? So with an unknown assailant at large in the community in fear, numerous suspects and theories surfaced in the aftermath of the Lake Bodom murders, and investigators looked at local characters with bad reputations, potential drifters or outsiders, and even the surviving victim himself. And over the years, speculation ran rampant. Early on, attention focused on a local resident named Carl Valdemar G. Y.L. Elstrom, infamously nicknamed Kiosk Man, because he ran a small kiosk in the campground near Lake Bodom. And G. Y.L. Elstrom was well known in the community, and not for good reasons, cause he had a history of hostility toward campers and young people in the area. Locals recounted that he would often shout at or harass people who came near his property. In fact, he was said to have cut down tents and thrown rocks at visitors he didn't like. Not a nice guy. So this pattern of aggressive, antisocial behavior made him an immediate person of interest when a campsite full of teens was savagely attacked. And many in town quietly suspected G. Y.L. Elstrom from the start, and some even claimed to have seen him behaving oddly on the morning of the murders. And according to later accounts, several witnesses said they saw G. Y.L. Elstrom returning from the direction of the campsite that morning looking wet, as if he'd been in the lake. But these people were too afraid at the time to inform police of this. And G. Y.L. Elstrom's own wife initially provided him an alibi, saying he had been home in bed with her during the early hours of June 5th, thus supposedly unable to be the killer. And police interviewed G. Y.L. Elstrom and searched his property but found no hard evidence linking him to this crime. So this kiosk man denied any sort of involvement, and aside from community rumors and his general creepy demeanor, investigators had nothing concrete. And they remained skeptical of the second-hand reports of his drunken confessions or supposed knowledge of the crime, because it was said that G. Y.L. Elstrom, when heavily intoxicated, allegedly blurted out confessions to the murders on multiple occasions, which is pretty suspicious to me. But okay. But when sober, he would either deny it or was just dismissed as a mentally disturbed individual. And police at the time chalked up his wild statements to him just being disturbed and did not pursue any charges. However, G. Y.L. Elstrom continued to draw suspicion, and he did nothing to help his own case in 1916 when he died by drowning in Lake Bodom, apparently by deleting himself from life. And according to local lore, G. Y.L. Elstrom, in a final note or conversation, hinted at guilt for the murders, though the exact details are murky. And after his death, a haunting revelation would come, and on her deathbed years later, Gyll Strom's wife recanted the alibi she had given him, and she confessed that she had lied to the police out of fear, implying that Gyll Strom had not been home at the time of the murders and that he had threatened to kill her if she revealed the truth. So this posthumous admission by the wife gave enormous weight to the theory that the kiosk keeper was the Bodom murderer. And villagers recalled that just days after the murders, Gyll Strom had filled in a well in his yard with concrete, so it was speculated that he might have hidden the murder weapons or bloody clothing in the well. And police later did excavate or examine the property but found nothing. Nonetheless, Gyll Strom remains one of the most popular suspect candidates in the public eye. He had motive, if seething hatred for campers or teenagers is a motive, and possible opportunity because he lived nearby, and just a general proclivity for violence. So locals have long believed that justice was never served if indeed Kiosk Man was the killer and managed to escape punishment by ending his own life. And in books and discussions, Gyll Strom's name often comes up as a likely culprit, a grumpy misanthrope who took his anger out on for innocent kids. But officially, however, Gyll Strom was never charged. And with his death, the lead effectively died with him, and the case file on him remains circumstantial. And police in later years stated they could not conclusively place him at the scene, and thus he is an unproven but strongly suspected figure in the Bodom case. So beyond the local kiosk man, investigators and amateur sleuths have scrutinized several other potential suspects, and to stand out for the level of attention that they've received, one is Hans Assmann and two is Pentti Sorninen. And each represents a very different profile, one a mysterious outsider with alleged spy connections, and the other a troubled youth who confessed under dubious circumstances. But let's talk about Hans first, and this name recurs in multiple Finnish unsolved cases, practically achieving a boogeyman status. Because Hans was a German-born, naturalized Finn who lived not far from Lake Bodom, and rumors swirled that he had been a soldier, even an SS guard at Auschwitz, and later possibly a KGB spy in Finland during the Cold War. Not people you want to be associated with necessarily. And whether or not the espionage tales are true, what put Assmann in the Bodom investigators' sights was his suspicious hospital visit on June 6, 1960. Remember when I mentioned that there was a man that walked in bloody at a hospital that night? This is the man. Because the very day after the murders, according to hospital staff in Helsinki, Assmann showed up wearing clothes covered in red stains and with black dirt under his fingernails. And he behaved nervously and even pretended to faint or be unconscious at one point. And doctors who examined him believed the red stains on his clothing were blood, and they noted his agitated state as well. And considering the timing, this was a giant red flag. So the hospital alerted the police about this strange patient. However, when briefly questioned, Assmann had an alibi and the police stated that he was able to account for his whereabouts during the Bodom murders. And some sources say authorities claimed Assmann was in Germany at the time, and others say he was in Helsinki but with someone. And in any case, the police seemingly accepted the alibi and did not confiscate his clothing for testing, which is an oversight that later drew a lot of criticism, which is deserved in my opinion. But Assmann notably also matched the limited description of the suspected killer because he had long blonde hair at the time and was fairly tall, and he looked eerily similar to the police sketch of the suspect. And intriguingly, after a newspaper published the birdwatcher's account of a blonde man seen leaving the tent, Assmann cut his long hair short. Oh, that's suspicious as well. And to some, this signaled a guilty conscience altering his appearance. And Assmann's name would surface in popular books years later, accusing him of not only the Bodom murders, but other unsolved killings in Finland. And a former doctor named Jorma Palo, who had seen Assmann at the hospital, became convinced of his guilt and authored several books outlining a theory of Assmann as a serial killer protected due to secret connections. So it's an interesting one and it goes deep into, like authority figures at government and cover-ups and all this kind of stuff, which at this age, I just wouldn't even put it past them at this point. But I don't know. One theory even posited that Assman's possible intelligenced eyes caused authorities to hush up or ignore evidence against him, essentially a cover-up scenario. And it is a very dramatic speculation, but it obviously caught the public's imagination. But Assman would die in the late 1990s, but not before reportedly confessing on his deathbed to at least one murder, though it's unclear if that referred to Bodom or another case. So officially, the police in 2005 reiterated that Assman had a verified alibi and was not considered a suspect by the original investigation. But to this day, many Finnish true crime enthusiasts think Hans Assman could have been the killer who slipped away. And then there's the lesser-known suspect, which is Pentti Soininen. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong, but he was a troubled Finnish man who during the mid-1960s was serving a prison sentence for other crimes. And he allegedly boasted to a fellow inmate that he was responsible for the Lake Bodom murders. But what do we know about criminals? They just love confessing anything just cause they want, like props in jail. But nevertheless, this jailhouse confession was taken seriously enough that he came under police scrutiny. However, a glaring fact undermines this claim, and that is that he was only about 14 years old at the time of the murders. So at 14, could he realistically have overpowered for older teenagers, two of whom were 18-year-old boys? And many, including the police, found that highly doubtful. And even if armed, a lone 14-year-old would likely struggle to subdue an entire group, especially with Seppo and Nils present. And some have speculated about him being a part of a larger group of assailants, but no evidence of multiple attackers was ever found. So inconsistencies in his story and lack of corroboration led authorities to view his confession with a lot of skepticism. I just think he just wants street cred in jail. And he would die by deleting himself from life in 1916, the same year G.Y.L.L. Strom did, before anything could be conclusively verified. So we'll never know. So with his death, this line of inquiry hit a dead end, and Soininen is generally considered an unlikely suspect, but his name occasionally arises when cataloging all who have claimed responsibility. So aside from named suspects, a few broader theories have circulated. And one is a possibility of a random drifter or foreigner passing through who committed the murders and then disappeared. But Finland in 1960 had relatively low crime, and a crime this violent was just unprecedented, prompting ideas of an outsider perpetrator. And some thought perhaps a violent escapee, prison or military deserter because there was an army base in the region, might have done it. And another theory poses that it was some kind of twisted revenge or vendetta. For instance, had one of the teens angered someone who then followed them to the campsite. But there's no evidence of any vendetta that ever emerged. And of course, there were those who whispered about supernatural or occult explanations, especially given the red eyes detail Nils mentioned. But those are firmly in the realm of legend. And by the 2002s, virtually every human suspect theory had been explored to some degree, with G.Y.L.L. Strom and Assman remaining the public's top picks for the likely culprits, until a bombshell whisk placed suspicion on someone who had long been presumed innocent, and that's the survivor, Nils Gustafsson. So, for 40 years, Nils Gustafsson was regarded as the unfortunate sole survivor of the Bodom attack, a victim left with physical and emotional scars. When Finnish police stunned the country by announcing that they had solved the case and they were charging Gustafsson with the murders. Now this development was nothing short of shocking. So how the heck did investigators come to suspect Nils after so many years? And the answer lies in a combination of new forensic analysis and revived witness testimony, which together formed a circumstantial case against him. So the cold case was reopened in the early 2000s by the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation, and with advances in DNA technology, forensic scientists re-examined the old evidence, including bloodstains on clothing and the tent. And one key finding was that Gustafsson's shoes, which recall had been found hidden 500 meters from the scene, had blood from the 3 slain victims on them, but none of Nils's own blood. Interesting. And this was a crucial clue for the prosecution. And their interpretation was that if an unknown attacker had bloodied Nils along with the others, Nils's own blood should be on his shoes. So the absence suggested that Nils was not wearing the shoes at the time he bled, when he sustained the injuries. And instead, the only blood on the shoes was from the other three, implying the shoes were worn during the killing of the others, because everybody else's blood was on his shoes, but his own blood wasn't on his shoes. As if he killed them and hid his shoes because he had killed them and there was blood on them, and it made him look guilty. So in the prosecutor's scenario, after killing his friends, Nils removed his shoes, now stained with victims and his friends' blood, and hid them, then later injured himself, accounting for his blood not being on his shoes. And this forensic reinterpretation was the backbone of the case against him. And investigators also revisited witness statements. Notably, there was a woman camper who came forward, and she claimed Nils and Seppo had drunkenly visited her tent on the evening before the murders and that Nils was acting aggressive. And this new testimony puts Nils's character in question, suggesting he might have been intoxicated and agitated that very night. So the prosecutors would weave a theory: Nils Gustafsson, in a jealous rage, murdered his friends. And according to their narrative, the four teens may have been drinking, and Nils became drunk and belligerent, and conflict would ensue. Possibly a fight between Nils and Seppo, perhaps over something like Nils making advances towards Seppo's girlfriend, or an argument about the girls in general. And in this supposed altercation, Seppo may have punched Nils, breaking Nils's jaw, which matches Nils's injury. And enraged by the fight and perhaps humiliated, the idea of a bruised Maliko was floated during this trial. Nils was said to have snapped. And the prosecution suggested that Nils then turned violent, and he may have attacked Melee first in a frenzy of jealousy or anger. And this would explain why Melee's injuries were so extreme as Nils's girlfriend. Maybe he targeted her in a jealous fury, and why her injuries were so much more severe. And then after she was deceased, then he went to eliminate the witnesses who were Arnger and Seppo. And in this scenario, Seppo's earlier fight injury to Nils accounts for Nils's broken facial bones. And after killing the others, Nils then staged the scene to look like an outside attack. The prosecutors alleged he hid some of their belongings to suggest robbery, hence taking wallets and keys, and he also removed his shoes, which were now covered in his own friend's blood, and hid them far away, likely in the early dawn, explaining the birdwatcher seeing a blond man walking away. Then, in a final gruesome step, Nils injured himself, and they proposed that he used either a rock or the tent pole to hit himself in the face, causing additional superficial stab wounds and worsening his concussion. And this was all to make it appear that he had been attacked as well. And finally, he collapsed on top of the tent and pretended to be unconscious as cover. So this was a dramatic-sounding theory. To me, it sounds like the most likely to be artist turd. Essentially accusing the victim of being the perpetrator after decades, it was a long shot. And when Nils Gustafsson, by then a 62-year-old retired bus driver, was arrested in March of 2004, it made headlines across Finland. And many found it hard to believe that the quiet man who had lived a blameless life for years was secretly a murderer. Yet the police insisted they had evidence and formally charged him, leading to a trial in 2005. And during the trial in August of 2005, the prosecution laid out the case I just described. And they pointed to the DNA blood evidence on the shoes, the witness who placed Nils drunk and aggressive that night, and even an alleged incriminating remark from Nils. And one police officer testified that while in custody, Nils had muttered, "What's done is done, I'll get 15 years. What did you say, Nils? Could you say that again on camera? What's going on?" Implying a subconscious confession that he expected to go to prison. The prosecution also had the two birdwatchers claim that the man they saw leaving the scene was indeed Nils, but the defense would dispute that identification. And they argued that no other suspect matched the evidence as well as Gustafsson didn't, that his motive was plausible given jealousy or intoxicated rage. And Nils Gustafsson's defense team, led by attorney Rita Lepp and IEMI, fought back vigorously. And they argued that the entire case was speculative and that Gustafsson could not have physically done it given his injuries. And they brought in experts to say that a person with a broken jaw and a concussion would have been unlikely to overpower 3 people and then calmly stage her, seen walking half a kilometer to hide items before injuring himself further. So the defense cast doubt on the reliability of the new witness as well, the woman camper who came forward after 45 years, and they pointed out May Lay's personal diary from the day of June 4th, 1960, that made no mention of any such visit to another tent, which it truly would have if something unusual had occurred. That's what they're saying. And they suggested this woman's memory might be faulty or influenced by the documentary process. And they also highlighted the contaminated crime scene, and any blood pattern conclusions to draw so many years later could be questionable, they said, because evidence was compromised. And the defense noted that no murder weapon was connected to Nilsen, that none of the missing items were found in his possession. And importantly, they argued that the original eyewitness accounts consistently indicated someone else, and the blonde man seen walking away was initially assumed to be the killer, not Gustafsson lying injured on the ground. In other words, the third-party involvement was more likely. This is what defense is saying. And they said that if Nils's blood was absent on the shoes, a simpler explanation was that he wasn't wearing them when attacked, and perhaps he was sleeping barefoot or the killer removed them for some unknown reason, and that didn't automatically mean he was the murderer, which, is fair. He could be not wearing shoes when he's sleeping, and that makes sense. But the trial captured national attention, and after weeks of testimony on October 7, 2005, the court delivered its verdict. And that was that Nils Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. And the judges found that the evidence was insufficient and too contradictory to convictory. And the DNA on the shoes raised suspicions but did not prove Nils's guilt beyond reasonable doubt, especially given the alternative interpretations. And the alleged motive was deemed speculative, and there was no direct evidence of a jealousy-fueled fight strong enough to trigger mass murder. And the long passage of time had adamantly made certainty impossible, as the court noted, so the presumption of innocence had to prevail. And after 44 years of being considered a victim, Nils Gustafsson walked out a free man, legally innocent and exonerated, and he was awarded $44,900 by the state as compensation for the mental suffering caused by the wrongful detention in trial. And Gustafsson, who had always maintained he had no memory and no guilt, expressed relief at the verdict. But despite the acquittal, opinions remained divided. Some in the public, swayed by the prosecution's narrative, still harbor suspicions about Gustafsson, and others believe he was just as much a victim as the friends he lost, and that the real killer was someone else who just got away with it. And the trial's aftermath left an uneasy feeling because if Nils wasn't the killer, then the case was back to square one, unsolved cold case. And if he was, then justice might not have been truly served given the acquittal. But officially, with Gustafsson cleared and no other active suspects, the Lake Bodom murders returned to cold case status after 2005, and no one has ever been convicted for the crime. And to this day, the question of who slaughtered those innocent teens by the lake is unanswered. And all the prominent suspects, including G.Y.L.L. Strom, Assman, Soininen, and Gustafsson, are either deceased or legally absolved, leaving the Bodom case cold. But let me know what you guys think down below. It's hard. It's hard. We have all this information now, and for me, looking at the brutality of the murder, especially of the significant other, and where they weren't everything, it is absolutely possible that someone could have been fixated on this group and done something like this time. But if we're looking statistically, it's usually someone that you know. So, in that regard, it looks like that with the broken jaw and all this. I don't know. I have no idea. All I know is that I feel horribly for the victims' families and for the victims themselves. No one deserves to die, especially at as young as they were, and it's just horrible. But I hope that one day it can be solved, but it doesn't look like it ever can be, given all the suspects are dead or absolved. So I'm not sure. But all I know is that these were horrible murders and the families deserve justice. But let me know what you guys think down below also. Let me know what other cases you want me to cover down below. I always read the comments, and I will see your beautiful face in the next video. Okay, Stay safe. Bye.